The blue lights hit your rearview mirror out of nowhere. Your hands tighten on the steering wheel. You weren't speeding. At least you don't think you were. You check your mirrors again. The siren chirps once, sharp and final. There's no doubt now. You're being pulled over. Your heart rate picks up just a little. You slow down, signal, and pull to the side. The engine idles. The silence inside your car suddenly feels louder than anything outside. You glance at your phone, resist the urge to grab it. You look at your hands. Where do they go? Steering wheel? Lap? You've seen videos. You've heard stories. You don't want to mess this up. The officer steps out of the patrol car. Slow, measured, watching you. Have you ever been in a traffic stop where you felt unsure whether what the officer was doing was actually legal? Tell me honestly in the comments, because your answer matters more than you think. And there's something most drivers misunderstand about these situations that I'm going to break down later. Because here's the truth that a lot of people don't want to hear. Traffic stops are one of the most legally complex and psychologically intense interactions the average person will ever have. And most drivers walk into them completely unprepared. Not just unprepared emotionally, but unprepared legally. What I'm about to walk you through isn't theory. This is how traffic stops actually play out in real life. This is how officers think, how situations escalate, and where the line gets crossed between legal authority and illegal behavior. And yes, that line gets crossed more often than people realize. Let's start with something subtle, something that doesn't feel illegal when it happens, but absolutely can be. You're pulled over. The officer walks up, asks for your license, registration, and insurance. You hand everything over. That part is standard, completely legal. But then something changes. The officer doesn't leave. Instead, they start asking questions, not about your driving, about where you're coming from, where you're going, who you were with, what you were doing. Where you headed tonight? Coming from work? Mind telling me what's in the car? Now pause for a second. Most people answer these questions automatically. It feels natural. It feels harmless. You want to be cooperative. You don't want to seem suspicious. But here's where things start to blur. Once the purpose of the stop is addressed, say a broken tail light or a minor traffic violation, the officer is not supposed to prolong the stop just to investigate unrelated matters without reasonable suspicion. That means they can't just keep you there indefinitely fishing for something. But in reality, they often try. Why? Because conversation is a tool. Silence makes their job harder. The more you talk, the more variables you introduce. Inconsistencies, nervous behavior, hesitation, these become building blocks for suspicion. And here's the part most drivers miss. The stop doesn't feel extended because you're participating in it. You're answering questions. You're engaging. You're helping the clock run. That's how a routine stop quietly turns into something else. Now imagine this scenario. You've been sitting there for 10 minutes, maybe 15. The officer goes back to their car, returns, then starts another round of questions. Anything illegal in the vehicle? You mind if I take a look? At this point, a lot of drivers feel pressure building. Not explicit pressure, but implied. Here's where another line gets crossed. Consent searches. Officers are allowed to ask for consent to search your vehicle. That part is legal. But what's not always legal is how that consent is obtained. If an officer uses coercion, intimidation, or misleading language to get you to agree, that consent can be invalid. But think about how this plays out in real life. You're on the side of the road, cars are passing, the officer is standing over you. Maybe their tone changes, slightly firmer now. So you don't mind if I check, right? That phrasing alone creates pressure. It implies that saying no is abnormal. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Many people say yes not because they want to, but because they feel like they have no choice. That's where things become legally questionable. Now let's talk about something that catches people off guard. Being asked to step out of the vehicle. You might feel like that's a red flag, like something serious is happening. But here's the nuance. Officers are generally allowed to order drivers, and even passengers, to exit the vehicle during a traffic stop for safety reasons. That part is legal. But what happens after you step out matters. If the officer starts using that moment to escalate into a search without proper justification, or uses your movement, your posture, your hesitation as a pretext to push further, that's where things can drift into illegal territory. Because now we're no longer dealing with safety, we're dealing with expansion of the stop, and expansion requires justification. Now imagine another situation. The officer takes your license and walks back to their car. You sit there waiting. 5 minutes pass, then 10, then 15. At some point you start wondering, what's taking so long? Here's what many drivers don't realize. Officers are allowed to run your information, check for warrants, verify registration. That takes time. But they're not allowed to hold your documents longer than necessary just to stall while waiting for something else, like a K9 unit. And yes, that happens. You'll see situations where a driver is kept waiting while another unit is called in. The officer might say nothing. They might keep you in that uncertain silence, because silence creates compliance. But legally, if the stop is being prolonged beyond its original purpose without reasonable suspicion, that becomes a serious issue. Now let's shift to something even more subtle: tone. You might not think tone matters legally, but it does, because tone affects perception, and perception affects behavior. An officer might start calm, almost friendly. "Hey, how you doing today?" Then slowly shift. "Why are you so nervous? Is there a reason you're avoiding eye contact?" Now think about that for a second. You're being questioned. Of course you're nervous. But that nervousness can be used against you. And here's where things get tricky. Nervousness alone is not supposed to be enough for reasonable suspicion. Courts have said this repeatedly. But in real-world scenarios, it often becomes part of the narrative. Driver appeared unusually nervous. That one line can justify further investigation. So now your natural reaction, your human reaction, becomes a factor working against you. Let's talk about passengers for a moment. You might think the focus is entirely on the driver, but that's not always the case. Officers sometimes turn their attention to passengers, asking similar questions. "Where are you guys coming from? How long have you known each other?" This isn't random. It's a strategy. They're looking for inconsistencies. If your answers don't match, that becomes a reason to dig deeper. But here's the issue. Passengers are not always required to answer these questions, depending on the situation and jurisdiction. And if officers pressure them into answering or treat refusal as suspicious, that can cross a line. Now let's get into something that many people misunderstand completely. Search is based on probable cause. You've probably heard that phrase before. If an officer has probable cause, they can search your vehicle without a warrant. But what counts as probable cause? This is where things get blurry. Officers might claim they smell something, or they might say they saw something. And here's the reality. Challenging that in the moment is nearly impossible. You're not going to win that argument on the side of the road. But that doesn't mean everything that happens is automatically legal. It just means the place to challenge it is later, not there. And this is where many drivers make a critical mistake. They try to argue in the moment. They raise their voice. They become defensive. They escalate emotionally. And that's exactly what makes things worse. Because now the situation shifts from a legal issue to a behavioral one, and behavior is something officers are trained to respond to quickly. Let's go deeper into that. Officers are constantly observing, not just what you say, but how you say it. Your hands, your breathing, your pauses, even silence. Yes, silence. You have the right to remain silent, that's well known. But exercising that right during a traffic stop can feel incredibly uncomfortable. You say, "I'd prefer not to answer questions." And suddenly there's a pause. The officer looks at you. Maybe they repeat the question. Maybe they change their tone. This is where psychological pressure comes in. They're testing your consistency. Will you hold that boundary, or will you break under discomfort? And here's the thing. Some officers push that line further than they should. Ignoring a clear invocation of your right to remain silent and continuing to question you aggressively can cross into improper conduct. But again, it doesn't always feel obvious in the moment. It just feels tense. Now let's talk about something that feels routine but can become problematic: field sobriety tests. If an officer suspects impairment, they may ask you to perform these tests. But here's what most people don't realize. In many places, these tests are voluntary. Yes, voluntary. But the way they're presented often doesn't feel that way. Step out of the vehicle. Follow my instructions. It sounds like an order. And in that moment, very few people feel like they can say no. But agreeing to these tests introduces risk. They're subjective, they're based on observation, and they can be influenced by nervousness, fatigue, even medical conditions. Now imagine performing these tests on the side of a road, under flashing lights, with cars passing by. Your balance isn't perfect, your focus is off. That becomes evidence. And if the officer didn't have sufficient reason to request the test in the first place, that's where legality comes into question. Let's circle back to something we touched on earlier: prolonged stops. Because this is one of the most common issues. You're pulled over for something minor, but instead of resolving it quickly, the stop stretches. Questions continue. Time passes. At some point, the original reason for the stop becomes secondary. That's a problem, because the authority of the stop is tied to its purpose. Once that purpose is fulfilled, extending it requires justification. Without that, the entire interaction starts to lose its legal footing. But again, here's the challenge. You're not going to resolve that on the roadside. What you can do is recognize it. Stay calm, stay aware, don't escalate. Because the goal in that moment isn't to win, it's to get through the interaction safely while preserving your rights. And there's one more thing, something that might surprise you. Small mistakes, not crimes, not violations, just small human mistakes. Reaching too quickly, speaking out of turn, interrupting. These can change the tone of the entire stop. An officer might interpret a sudden movement as a threat. They might interpret hesitation as deception. And once that perception shifts, everything that follows is influenced by it. That's why awareness matters, not just of the law, but of the situation. Because traffic stops are not just legal encounters, they're human encounters, filled with uncertainty, interpretation, and split-second judgment. And sometimes, lines get crossed, not always dramatically, but subtly, quietly, in ways that most people don't even realize until it's too late. So the next time you see those blue lights in your mirror, remember this feeling, that moment of tension, that uncertainty. Because what you do in the next few minutes, what you say, what you don't say, how you respond, can shape everything that follows. And the difference between a routine stop and a complicated one often comes down to things most drivers were never taught to notice.